My wife's parents, aka my in-laws, asked me to build them a stand for their TV console. They pretty much just wanted to elevate it like 6-7 inches off the ground so that they could see their TV more clearly from the dining room table. So I designed it in Fusion, made some plans, went to Menards and bought some edge-glued pine. I decided to use pine for this project mostly because it's cheap, and I don't think I had enough walnut or maple in my current store to make something like this anyway. So I'm planing one of the surfaces here that I prepared earlier just to make it a uniform thickness and nice and smooth. And this construction here is pretty much just going to be a wooden box. It'll make more sense later on, but I cut everything down on the table saw before taking it over here and trimming the top and bottom pieces to their final length using a handheld track saw thing. And then I'm checking the measurements of the internal ribs, supports, whatever you want to call them. Got those all trimmed to the right width on the table saw. And checking the fit here, making sure everything is nice and flush, and it is. And then I do a dry, rough assembly here, and like I said, this is where things maybe will make more sense. It's a wooden box, pretty much. And then that front there gets covered with this piece here that we were planing earlier, so I'm trimming that to the right width, and then now to the right length. Checking it over there against my top and bottom pieces before doing the final cut. And then for the inside of the top and bottom, I decided to do a little chamfer just to give it a nice little profile. So I did several test cuts before deciding on what I thought was the right dimension. I had this in my 3D plans, but I decided, who needs to measure? You don't need to measure. So I just kind of eyeballed it and thought, yeah, that looks good. Maybe that'll come back to bite me later. But anyway, at this point, I decided to sand everything, initially at least. I think I used 150 grit, maybe. That sounds about right. I'm planning on joining this whole thing with dowels. I don't have a domino or any other fancy equipment, so we'll use the tried and true dowel. And I thought it'd be a good idea to do a test piece. I made that little jig there to try to get accurate spacing, and drilled a couple holes on some scrap and tested it, and I was pretty happy with that fit. So I got to work marking all of the actual pieces and drilling those holes for the dowels. Pretty sure these are 1/4 inch dowels. They might not be the strongest, but I think it'll suit this purpose just fine. If I had another chance to do this, I'd probably use 3/8 inch dowels, but you live and you learn. So testing one of the pieces here, and it's a pretty good fit. I was pretty happy. So in my excitement and haste, I went ahead and marked all of the other dowel holes on both sides there. I'm just going to do the top, or rather the bottom first. And doing another test fit here. I was pretty pleased with that. Pretty soon I had all of the bottom holes drilled, and I put the top on just for another dry fit and to make sure things still looked good this far into the project. So then I clamped the top in place and marked where the ribs, the supports, met the top. And then I flipped the piece over and started drilling where the dowels should go. Yeah, this didn't work out so well, which you'll see here. This is a really sped up shot of me trying to do a massive glue up. And I guess I didn't show it here, but they didn't line up. I did not calculate correctly where the dowels should meet the top from the support ribs. So I went inside and stressed out about it for a while before finally deciding, all right, I can redo this. So I plugged all of the holes using dowels, and then once that glue had dried, I sawed them off and was like, all right, I'm going to redo all this work. I'm going to go a little bit slower and try not to screw it up this time. So I went inside, tried to fall asleep, stressed about it, came out the next day with a fresh attitude, and decided I'm going to go a little bit slower and just really focus on trying to get these dang holes lined up. So I started drilling again, using a little jig there to make sure I don't go too deep, and doing another test fit. And as before, that worked out well. But really, the key here was transferring those holes from the bottom to the top. So like before, I clamped everything in place, and actually, before we get there, I realized that the front piece wasn't going to work. So I had to take a handsaw here and chop off just a sliver of those little ribs. I already glued some of those in place, so I couldn't take those off and take them over to the table saw, so I had to do this by hand. Just used a little Japanese saw and then a chisel to clean things up, which actually worked out pretty well. You can see here that we got a nice flush fit on both ends with a little bit of space in the middle, which is fine. So now was the glue up. I decided to glue the bottom pieces in place first and try a different method to transfer those holes, which you'll see here in a minute. The next day I took the clamps off after the glue had dried and proceeded to do the same thing with the end cap there. More clamps and a little bar to spread the pressure. And then I tried to dry assemble at least partially everything before realizing that the front piece did not meet that chamfer the way I wanted it to. So again, I took that Japanese saw and a chisel and chopped off a little bit on either end, and then reassembled everything, at least in a dry state, and then marked where the holes should go. And then I drilled just the top piece, and then I'm going to use these dowel hole markers to transfer those holes. So you pop them in the holes you just drilled, and then reassemble everything, and then push down, and that sharp point will transfer a hole directly onto the piece. You can see that there, and I just mark it a little bit more with an awl before drilling out the hole for the dowel. And in theory, this should be exactly aligned, and it is. Thank goodness. Whew. So I rinsed and repeated for the other ribs, doing 2 at a time because I only have 2 of those dowel markers. This didn't really take too long, actually, and plus it was kind of fun. So once I got everything drilled, I clamped it in place for another dry fit before realizing I needed to trim just a hair off that front piece. And then I sanded the interior a bit because I had some pencil markings. And then I decided I was going to pre-finish the interior before gluing everything up. So I'm using some pre-stain conditioner here before applying the actual stain. And while that soaked in, I was actually smoking a pork butt this day. Got up at like 6 a.m. and put this puppy on, and this is like, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours into the smoke, and it worked out well. It was delicious. Anyway, here's the stain I'm using. It's an oil-based dark color, walnut maybe. I wiped it on and then let it sit for a bit, wiped it off, and once it had cured after a couple days, I am using some wipe-on polyurethane just for the interior. One, just because it's cheap, it's pretty easy to apply, and I don't really care how it looks because it's the inside. I just wanted to at least seal the wood. So I applied 1 coat, let that dry for a couple hours, roughly sanded it, and then applied a second. Again, this is just really to seal the wood. It worked out pretty well. Now for affixing this front panel, I wanted it to be removable so you could access the interior for storage, so I'm drilling some holes for some magnets. The thought is that magnets on either end, with a corresponding magnetic bit on this end, aka I'm just going to use screws, so you can do some slight depth adjustment too. But yeah, here, snap it in place, and if you want to access the interior for storage, you can. So now it was time for the glue up once everything had dried. So this is a massively sped up shot of me just applying glue and on the dowels on both surfaces, and then a whole bunch of clamps with some of those cauls to spread the load. And then the next day I took all the clamps off and the structure was complete. Now I could get to finishing the outside, and I repeated the same process, pre-stain conditioner, followed by that stain. After a couple days, once it had finally dried, I thought it was time to put my Maker brand on here, so I heated that up, did a light sand to remove some of the extra burnt wood, and then you can see right here just how it looks. This is on the bottom, by the way, the front left corner maybe. Then I did the final hand sand on all the exterior surfaces before applying finish. This is Osmo Poly X oil. It's a hard wax oil that you buff on with a non-scratching Scotch-Brite before wiping it off. After 6 or so hours, you can apply a second coat, which I did. And then after a day or so, it's fully cured. Actually, I think it's more like a week it's fully cured. But anyway, once that was done, I took it over to my in-laws' apartment and installed it. You can see how it sort of matches their existing console, but I think it provides a nice contrast. Here it is with the front removed. You can see that you can access storage under there, and in its final state, this is what it looks like. Thanks for watching.